It has been a long while since we've seen spending commitments like this from the main parties, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's significant, a very significant turning point, I think, actually, in UK politics, in that, yes, what we should probably still call the two main parties, because it appears they still are now both promising to increase public spending and increase the amount they borrow to invest in projects like big infrastructure projects. And actually, from the New Economics Foundation's point of view, that's something that's long overdue. We have an ailing economy, and it's ailing in part because government isn't doing its part to get the economy up and running.
Both parties saying they want to spend more than they have been spending. Labour say they want to spend more than the Conservative Party. This follows the best part of a decade of austerity in one form or another. It follows Theresa May saying there's no magic money tree. Does this money exist? Can it exist? How will it be created to be spent?
Well, governments aren't like households. Governments are more or less there in perpetuity. And governments have this thing that you or I don't have. You know, for 4 decades or so, we've laboured under this myth, which I think was really started by Mrs. Thatcher, that, the government is like a household. But it isn't really, because you and I can't borrow to the extent that a government can borrow, because we don't have this guaranteed long-term tax income. And actually, if the government borrows wisely and invests that money wisely, in fact, what should happen is the tax income will grow. So it'll actually improve the government's ability to borrow and tax and spend over the long term. So, in fact, a government is, which is why markets really like governments, and they like investing in government bonds, putting money into the government schemes that they borrow for, because they're really good, steady, long-term investments of the sort that actually, particularly at the moment, are really lacking. So this whole idea, we've got to get over this whole idea that the government is like a household. It really isn't. Yeah. So this isn't poor thinking. It's good thinking on the part of both of the parties, to a slightly greater or lesser extent.
And obviously, for those reasons, debt is not a problem for governments in the way that it is and can be a problem for households. But nonetheless, we do as a country owe a lot of money. Is it, what you've said notwithstanding, a good idea to be significantly perhaps increasing the amount of money that we borrow?
Well, I think there's pretty much a consensus among I guess what you call at least sort of relatively progressive economists, that we should be borrowing and investing more. The government should be borrowing and investing more in the economy. So then the question really comes around, well, how much? So the Organisation for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which is a kind of big intergovernmental organisation that largely works with industrialised countries like ours. Now, it says that the government should be really looking to invest around 3.5% per year of their GDP. And in fact, what Labour has promised is around that figure. So what Labour is saying it will spend if it gets elected is around that figure. The Tories slightly less. But, it is really significant that both are recognising the need to do that. And why are they doing that? Well, it is pretty sound economics, but also it's pretty sound politics, because people have had enough of austerity, and they've had enough of it for a very good reason, and that's because, particularly if you tend to be on a lower income, if you have a disability, if you use public services a lot, if you've got children that need childcare, or if you're elderly or you have elderly relatives who need a lot of health care, it is getting pretty tough out there. People are feeling that. And that's one of the reasons why I think a lot of people are really unhappy with the way politics is. So I think we can see this as a political response as well as an economic response. It doesn't feel like we can go down that austerity route anymore. And from New Economics Foundation's point of view, that's a very good thing.
What do you think austerity was intended to achieve? And do you think that within its own terms, it succeeded?
We think austerity is one of the worst and most poorly conceived policies in history, really, because not only has it caused a lot of suffering across many communities, and I think it's hit a lot of communities that don't tend to get the spotlight put on them, don't get seen very much, smaller towns and smaller cities generally speaking, the central areas of larger cities have done better, smaller towns and smaller cities have done a lot worse. And it's hit those places and people in those places very hard. And that was unnecessary. And it was unnecessary because it's also hit the economy. So the economy is smaller than it would have been now if we hadn't had austerity.
Right.
And that's pretty inexcusable from both an economic and a social point of view.
I think what I want to test then, perhaps, let's finesse this a little bit. I imagine at some point, perhaps Conservative politicians, particularly during the campaign, may well say austerity has enabled the spending spree on which we are about to embark. Does that stand up as an argument?
There's two different things to weigh up. One is the kind of current account of the government, as it were, where bringing, but again, both parties are trying to be quite disciplined about this still. So the idea that over a period of time, so over the period of a government or slightly longer, you don't actually spend any more than you can raise in tax. And that's not a bad discipline in terms of your current account, as if you like. I am comparing to a household, if you like, now, but in terms of what you tax and spend on a daily basis, and then what you borrow to invest over the longer term. And I think that's probably one of the most harmful sides of austerity, was the fact that borrowing to invest over the longer term was cut. And we're all feeling that now. We're all feeling the fact that infrastructure in the country is pretty ragged. We haven't got the kind of public services that we feel like we need. Things like schools and hospitals haven't been invested in anywhere near as much as they should have been. So, I mean, at the New Economic Foundation, we would argue that austerity as a whole was flawed, but certainly one of the most harmful sides of that is the cutting back of borrowing to invest, which is a government responsibility, and we would argue it's irresponsible if a government isn't doing that, up to a point. And actually, as I say, both parties, I mean, the Conservatives have accused Labour of going over the top, spending too much. But actually, if you measure their pledge against what the OECD suggests government should be investing, it's not that wildly different.
How does Brexit intersect with this, if it happens? And of course, one of the possible outcomes of this election is that it does not. But if it does that mean there will be less money around from which to start as we look ahead to spending more?
Well, yes, but then paradoxically, of course, cutting more would be a real mistake at that point, because if the economy is sort of broadly speaking made up of the government spending and the private sector spending, and in a recession, which is, if that's what we have post-Brexit, the private sector spends less, then the government needs to also think about filling that gap to make sure the economy doesn't shrink any further than it needs to. And again, this is what should have happened in the aftermath of the last recession, and it happened for a bit, but then suddenly we got austerity from 2010 onwards, and that's harmed our economy, and it's harmed it in a way which we've never recovered from, actually. So it's really critical that Brexit isn't used as an excuse by any parties to go back into an austerity kind of approach, because that would be really harmful and actually, again, politically really undermining, because people have felt the pain over the past 10 years. And you could argue, and many have, that one of the reasons behind the Brexit vote is that pain. So if we go further down that route in response to Brexit, that's going to cause an awful lot more pain. And I haven't even mentioned, and many of my colleagues will shoot me if I don't, I haven't even mentioned climate change. Biggest single challenge we face. If we can't invest in the kind of solutions that we need to that massive climate change challenge now, then in the future we'll be an awful lot poorer, because we'll face the very high costs of a climate that's out of control. So for that reason alone, now we should be looking towards an awful lot more government investment.
The numbers here are staggering. They always are when we talk about government finances. For obvious reasons, we're talking in any context about huge sums of money. The Conservatives proposing a cap on public investment at 3% of GDP. I mean, that sounds like a limit. That sounds like they're talking down these figures, but actually that would mean we'd be talking about a level that we've not seen for the last 40 years. The Labour Party planning to spend an extra £55 billion per year year on investment over the next 5 years. So the two main parties turning on the money taps. Do you have any sense that as we head into this election campaign, one or both of the main parties is going to have to say to the electorate, if you want this, you'll have to pay for it through higher taxes?
I would have thought it's almost inevitable that there's going to have to be some degree of higher taxation, but there is an opportunity to do that in a way that is fair. There's a number of, for instance, a really good example is that at the moment in the UK, we don't tax wealth at the same rate as we tax income. So aligning those two would seem to make a lot of sense, which would bring in some levels of some higher levels of taxation. So what I think we probably will see are some ideas about how to tweak different areas of taxation, particularly wealth taxation, which will bring in a bit more money. What I think it's really unlikely that we'll see is promises, for instance, the Labour Party has ruled out the idea of increasing income tax on any other than the top 5% of earners, which, depending on how you calculate it, is anything above sort of around 60,000 a year or more, or maybe even as high as 80,000 a year. And I think most of us would agree that's quite a high income. If you're going to tax, it should be fair. And fairness in our minds at least, means that you're trying to take the burden off those households who, we have a massive and fast rising problem with debt in households in the UK, which is a very different phenomenon from government debt. And it's because, a lot of that is because people are trying to exist on incomes that are well below £20,000 a year. And in order to do that, they're having to borrow to make ends meet. They're not borrowing for frivolous things. They're borrowing on their credit cards month after month, debt piling up, often paying back more than they twice or more than that sum that they borrowed, and it's to alleviate the burden on those households that we really need to think about.
And just on the public spending pledges that are being made by both parties, how do you see these huge public service projects helping the people who month to month are having to use their credit cards to buy milk and loo roll?
Well, I think that's a very, very good question. So I can't speak for what the parties will pledge, but for instance, something that we wouldn't do at the New Economics Foundation is spend what I think is now predicted to be about 80 billion on building high-speed rail 2, for instance. What we would spend, or recommend that money was spent on, is insulating people's homes, because that will both help us with that climate change challenge I talked about, but also it will bring down people's heating bills. One of the things that's almost bound to happen if we increase public spending is that workers in the public sector will receive a bit more salary, and workers in the public sector are often among the lowest paid. So, again, that will not only give people a bit more money in their pockets to buy those essentials, but put more money into the economy and help boost the economy as we go along. So, the things that the government now has, or the things that the next government critically has to weigh up, are threefold, essentially, when it's spending money. One is, does it help us with that climate change challenge? I really do think that's number one. The second one is it going to help the households who most need it? Are these measures that are really going to put money into people's pockets or help their lives be more comfortable and affordable? And the third thing is, are those areas of expenditure going to mean that we have, productive growth in the economy? Actually, are we going to see money back for the money that we invest? And if it meets those challenges, then I think it's a really good investment.